data not found in cache. So that's the first message we want to send when the user visits the route. And then we will just say, hello my friends, I hope you are all doing well. Today I'm going to break down how to set up a production grade full stack application using React, Node.js with TypeScript. Whether you are a developer or a SaaS founder, this guide will show you the best practices for scalable web development. Before we get started, make sure you have Docker Compose, Node.js and TypeScript installed on your system. Once you have those installed, you can open your terminal and run the following command to create your project structure. So this structure will hold your front end and back end code. Next, we also need to create a YAML file for Docker Compose so that we can set up Postgres and Memcached. This isolated environment ensures consistency across development and production. Run the following command to create the YAML file for Docker Compose. And write the following code for the configuration of the services. So first we need to create the database. So we pull the Postgres image and then we also give it the container name for PostgresDB and we give it the port. Postgres expects us to give the environment variables for the database, so we give it the user web app and then we give a password. Make sure to use a strong password, and then we also give the database a name, and then we will map the Postgres database volume so that we persist our volume in order for us not to lose data. We also created a network for the database, so we are only allowing the database to talk to the backend. And also we created a Memcached image, so we pull the image, we give it the container name, and we also give it the port, as well as we are allowing Memcached to only talk with the backend network. Now next, we also created the network for the application. So the network, we created a database network and also a front-end network as well as a back-end network. We are only allowing the backend to talk to the database and the front end to only talk to the backend. So we do not allow front end to go directly and talk to the database because that could create a security vulnerability. As well as we created the volume for the application. So with your Docker desktop running, make sure to run the following command. we didn't save the file, so we got an error. So make sure you save the file before you run the command. Now it's pulling and setting up the configuration. We have an error. Memcached is already in use. Okay. Now we've cleaned the system, so let's run the command again. Now it's pulling the images and setting up the application. So that's done. We can move on. Now let's switch to the backend. So navigate to the backend folder and initialize a Node.js project with TypeScript. So open the terminal inside the backend folder and run the following command. Once the setup is done, run the following command to install TypeScript globally on your system. Now let's create two files to hold our application dependencies. So we'll use the command line again to create the following files. So once that is done, add the following to the various files. So with the dev requirement file, we need to install nodemon, and we also need to install TypeScript and the TS node. We also need concurrently and Chokida CLI, as well as we need Morgan and Wisting. We save the file, and also let's do the same for the requirement. In the requirement file, make sure to list the following files, the following here. So we are installing Express, we are installing course, and we are installing Memcached, as well as .env with helmet. And then we also need SQLize and Postgres for connecting to the database. Once that is done, let's open the package.json and configure the application. Add the following command so that we can run just one command and it will install all the dependencies for our application. So we are just using yarn, and then we will cut the files, the requirements. So it's requirements files, requirements.txt. So we will make sure we have the requirement file, and then we have the dev requirements.txt file also. Now from the command line, we can just run yarn dev install, and this will install all the dependencies for us. You can also install them one by one, but it's much better to do it this way so you can always keep track of your application dependencies. Once that is done, now we need to make sure we set the build command to TSC. Once that is done, we need to generate the TypeScript configuration for the backend application. So we run the following command. This will create a generic TypeScript configuration file for us. We have to populate the TypeScript configuration file with the following. Now that is done, let's create an index.ts file so we can begin building our Node.js application. So from the command line in the backend folder again, run the following command. This will create the index.ts file for us. Let us now populate the index.ts file with the following. So we are just instantiating the express to the variable and giving it the port, and then we will just create a base home route for our application, and then the application will listen on the following port, and then we will just console.log the following to the screen. Let's save the file. Once you have done that, come back to the package.json, and then we also need to populate the package.json script with the following. Once that is done, now we are just using the nodemon to run the application, so that whenever we save the file, we don't need to stop the server and start the server again. It will just restart for us in development. So yarn dev start. Now we start the application. Because we created the index.ts file in the root directory, it is giving us the error. So we need to create a source file and move the index.ts into that folder. So now we created the source folder. Let's move the index.ts file into the source folder. Now that we move it into the source folder, let's start the application again. Now we can see our application is running successfully. Let's try and see when we visit the application from the browser if we will get the message from the base route. Good. Now we can see hello from the backend, so which means Everything is working as expected. So next, let us set up the front end as well. So move into the front end folder. Make sure your terminal is in the front end folder. Run the following command to set up the front end for the application. Now start the application. This throws us some error because of some incompatible dependencies. Let's try and remove the node modules folder and try to install it again. Let us install the node modules again. So run yarn install. That solves our problem, and now we can see that our application is running. Good. So now let's go back to the backend folder. Let's do some few more configurations we need for the application. Stop the server. Let's create the following folders to neatly organize the application. So we run the following command to create the various folders inside the source D3. We need a controllers folder to hold all the application logic. We need the route folder to hold all the route configurations for the application, and then we also need a models folder for the database modules. We also need a config folder for application configuration, and we also need utils folder for some of the utilities we will need for the application. So let's run the command. This creates the folders for us. Now inside the utils folder, let us create a login for the application. Inside the utils, let us create a file called logger.ts, and then we will write the following code. So we will import Wisting from Winston, and then we will use it to create a logger for our application. It's always best to log rather than using console.log when you are running in production, when you are running a production grade application. So when we go back to the index file, now instead of we are using console.log, we will just use the logger. So logger, and we will import it from the logger, and then we will give it info, and then we just put the message we want here. So the server is running on the local host. Let's start the server again. Yarn dev start. It's yarn dev start. Now we are logging the application. Open the inside the config folder. Let us create a file called index.config.ts, and over here we are just going to do some basic configuration for the application. Now inside the index.config.ts file, first of all we will import the .env. First of all we import .env, we run the config. Next we will also fetch the app mode. And again we will set the environment variables depending on the application mode. So we save the file. Let us create a basic configuration for application. So we will say export const, we can call it whatever we want, app config. App config, and then we will give the following configuration for the application. Is const, not const. We will now set the following configuration for the application. So we will get the mode, and we also set the password for the application. We also get the app host name, and we also get the Memcached host name as well as the Memcached port. So once that is done, we need to create a .env file for our application. So for a production grade application, it's always better to separate your environment variable. So first of all, inside the root directory, let's stop the server again and go back. Clear the screen. Let us create the following .env files inside the root directory of the application. So now we have .env for the development environment and also for the production environment. Inside the development.env environment, add the following code. Now we are setting the environment variable to development, and then we will give the app port, and then we also give the host name of the application, and then we also give the host for the Memcached DB as well as the port. Over in the production, put the same code, but then we will just call here production, and then let's say in production we want a different port to run, so we just give it 5007. So we also give it the app host. For now I'm using localhost, but then you can put your domain here, and then you can also use the same for the Memcached. The Memcached D port is always going to be the same, 112211. So let's save the file, and now let's go back to the index.ts file inside the source folder. Now inside the index.txt file, let us update our login message. So we just need to import the app config here. So we will import the app config from the config folder and the file inside the file index.config. Now let's save the file. Let's start our application yarn dev. So it's yarn dev start, yarn dev start. And now you see it tells us that we are in the development mode, so that is good for us at least. So now that we've got the backend running on the port 5004, I think we could see that we have hard-coded the port here, so we need to make sure we are rendering the port dynamically as well. So we just have to app reference the app config and then app, and then we called it port. So now it will pick the port number in the environment variable. So let's say whenever we stop the backend server and want to run it in production mode to see if it is working, we can just run it in production mode also to test the port if it's picking the right port number. So node env, and then you give it production, and then you run probably we can just run the yarn, I believe it's yarn start, because we have already configured it in the backend in the package.json, so we can just run yarn start. It will build the application and then set the environment variable to production. So now the port number is 5009. Let's confirm it in the production.env file, and there we go. So moving on, we are now going to add middlewares to our application. So if you look inside the dev requirements, we have installed Morgan, so we also need to make sure we are using Morgan. We are now going to move on to setting up middlewares. In any robust web application, you always face challenges like inconsistent login and also incoming JSON data, because you are always going to get and pass JSON objects. So we need to also handle them well, and we also need to ensure that we have set the cost so that we can allow cross-origin access. So without further much talking, we can just move on by setting the JSON, referring the express JSON, and also we need to use URL encoded, and then we set it to true. And also we need to use Morgan, app.use Morgan. Make sure to import Morgan, and then we will use dev, but because this is a production grade application, we need to use combine. Now we save it. So basically Morgan is going to help us log every route that the user visits. So now let's say we visit our because this is in production, let's stop in production and put it back to development mode. So yarn dev start. So now we are in the development mode, and we need to check if when a user visits our route, it does log the application to the console. Go to the browser and just paste it in here. And then we can see we can get this route, the base route. So we have to check the console if it logged. Now we get it logged. That is good. Moving on, we are going to add the caching layer to our API in order to make it very robust. So first, we need to create the Memcached instance. So const Memcached, I call it Memcached, and you call it a new Memcached. Make sure to import Memcached, and then you can give it the path. But because we can hard code it like this using the local host and then giving it the port, but it's always best to use environment variables so you are able to manage them easily. So I believe we did something with the app config, so we can always refer. We have it here. So memcache host and then memcache port. So I will bring it back here and say, instead of doing this, now I will do we give it string interpolation and say we give it app config.app, and then we also give it the host name, and then we call the app config, and then we call the app, as well as we are giving it the port again. So now it should be instantiated for us. Now let's create the caching for our application. First of all, we need to do app.get. So the base route, we just do this for the base route, and you can always extend this. App.get, and then we will say whenever somebody visits the base route. So next is request. We give it request, response. Make sure to import the TypeScript object for response and as well as request. So next we need to make a cache key for the application. So I can declare a variable up here and say const memcached key. You can give the key anything you want. So once we have declared the key, we can now use it in our function. So we just say memcached dot get, and then it requires two values. So first of all, we need the key, so memcached key, and then gets the callback function. Nice. So now we can say if there is, we can if now we can say if there is any error, we just need to return a message to the user. So if error, we first log it to our system, and then next we return a message to the client. So return rest.status, and then we will give it 500, and then we will pass a JSON object. We just say internal server error. So next, if there is data inside the memcached, then we also need to log a message to the client side. So if data, first we also log it to the console, logger.info data fetch from memcached. So, and then we return a message to the user, and then we return a message to the client. So we can say message, and then we will give a message, data fetched from cache, and then we will pass the data. And in the case where there is no error and the data is not being cached, then we need to make the request goes to the base route. So we will say else const message data not found in cache. So that's the first message we want to send when the user visits the route. And then we will just say you have to set it to memcached. So memcached dot set, and then we pass the key. We pass the key, and then we pass the message, as well as we give it how long we need to cache it for. For now, I will just cache it for 2 seconds. And then again, if there is an error, then we need to throw a message to the client. So if error, logger dot error, and then we will give it the error message. And then we also need to return a response to the client. So now return response.status, again 500, internal server error. In the event where there is no error, then we need to return a response to the client. So return rest.status, and then we will pass the message. So hopefully we should be able to see it now when we visit the base route, but now we need to remove this base route here. Good. Now let's test it. Okay, now the server for the Memcached is not running, so it keeps hanging. So make sure you have run the command to start both the Postgres and the Memcached server. So in the root directory of the project where we have the Docker compose file, we just have to run it again. But before, I just have to check Docker ps. So my status is exited, so I need to start it up. So Docker compose up. You can let it run in the background by running D, but for now, for debugging purposes, I just will let it run. This will take a moment. Now that it's running, let's try again and see. Good. So now we can see data not found in cache. Let's run it again. Data not found in cache. Let's run it again. Data not found in cache. Okay. The time for the caching is too small. 2 seconds is not a lot, so let's put 30 seconds. Data not from cached. And now we can see data fetched from cache. So the data not found in cache. Good. Good. Now we can move on. Now it's complaining we are missing the app config. Import the app config. So we have some roadblocks here that I think it's complaining that the get does not exist on the type, because we have mismatched the name. So it should be small letter here. Memcached, it should be small letter, should match, because now we were referencing the main Memcached instead of the instantiated Memcached we created. So once our error is sorted, let's see if this will work. Save the file. So we go into the index.route.ts for the base route, and then we have to import our base controller function here. Then import it here, save the file. Now we have to go back to the main index.ts file, and then we need to update the route. So let's give a comment here, and then we'll say route. So every route will come underneath here. So now, in order to use the route, we have to use app.use, and then what are we going to say? So the base route, and then we have to use the router, and then we have to use the router. So base route, import base route here. So base route, so I believe now we should be done. And moment of truth, we need to go back to the browser and try to verify it out. Okay, so it's working. Data not found in cache. Let's try again. And data fetched from cache. Good. So we have successfully decentralized our application into smaller components or into smaller units. So now we are going to have all our route logic here, and then we also have the controller logic inside the controller folder, as well as whenever you have modules for your database, you can also put them here in the modules, and any configuration to the application should go into the config file. This makes your code much more neatly organized. Moving on, I think the front end as it looks now, it's nice, it's beautiful, but I believe we can be a bit nerdy and make the front end talks to the back end, and then at least we will see if it works. So let's give it a shot. Now close the whole files and then go into the front end folder, open the app.ts. Now remove everything, so let's create it again. I'll give it a title. Everything is working, but I do not like that the background is too white, so I will just change it right now. Background color, and I'll say 2C, and then the text color, I will give it FFF. Now it's good enough. Nice. How about align items, center, and justify content center, and flex display. So I have everything aligned in the middle. So let's see what we can do now. Inside the front end source directory, let's create a new folder called services. This is where we are going to do most of our API logic. So I'll again create a new file here, index.service.ts. So let's close all these things. Let's open the file again, service index.service.ts. So we need to import Axios. You can use fetch, but we will use Axios for this. So we need to import Axios from Axios. We need to make sure we install Axios, so you can open npm package manager and then look for Axios. So you can find Axios and then you can read a lot about the documentation over here. So it has 60 million downloads every week. So we just with one command, let's stop the server for the front end. So yarn add Axios. Now we have Axios installed. And start again. Okay, because we are using TypeScript, we need to ensure we are installing the types as well. So yarn add types, yarn add types slash as yours. So now it's working. Just had to remove and re-import it again. Now it's working. So let's say we have the API routes. So const API URL and then it's let's find the API URL. It's going to be this. So that's our API URL. Now let's say we need to make a test. So const, first of all we need to export it. So export const test equals to an async function. And then we will just say const response equals to await as yours dot get, and then we'll call the API base route, and then we just return the data. Okay, we need to make sure this is a string, so we need to make sure it's in a string form. So that's it. Close the file. Let's go into the app.ts and then let's try to make it work here. So inside the function, let's try and use state. So const data set data, and then we'll just say import useState. So useState from React. It can be empty, so it can be null, or it can be an empty string. For now, it's going, the default state is going to be null, and we need to fetch the data. So const fetch data equals to async function, and then we will just say const response equals to await. Then we call our function that we made. So inside the index.service, let's call the test await test. Make sure to import test from the service.index.ts. So test. Once that is done, say we have to set the data. So set the data to the response object that we get. Let's console.log the data. Now that is done, we need to make sure we are calling it in the use effect, so that whenever the component mount, it will render the data. So use effect, and then we will just call the fetch data. Normally you can put this function into a use effect function, but you need to know that with use effect you can't use async. So for me, it's better to write the function and then just call the function inside the use effect. So now let's check moment of truth. Let's look at the console, inspect. Okay, we need to start the server. So yarn start. Okay. So we get the null error. So now we have an error, so we need to make sure that our API route is correct. Let's check the backend if we did hit it. Stop the backend and run again. Look at the network. Okay, so we are not hitting it, so we need to fix the error. So we need to make sure to fix this error, because obviously there is something wrong with the backend API URL, because obviously it's an invalid URL. So let's see what we did wrong in the index.service.ts. So now we can see we have the API URL here, and then we are sending the GET request to the API URL. But you see, we do not have tests, and obviously I don't know how I ended here, but this is not how it should be. So we have to remove the tests from there, because we do not have any appended extensions to the URL. So let's just save the file and go back to the screen. Okay, now we have a different error. Okay, so now it says we have error related to the cross origin resource sharing policy. As I said before, when you do not set this in your backend API, you are not going to be able to access your backend API from the client side. So you need to open that up. So go back to the backend, go into the index file, and now in the at the middleware section, we do not have cost set, so we need to ensure that we are setting cost. So app.use and then say cost. Obviously I hope we have installed cost. Let's check the requirements. We have cost, so import, make sure to import cost. Let's remove this one from here. Import cost from cost. So now when you leave it blank, it's going to accept request from every URL. So let's leave it blank and see. Now we can fetch the data, but for security purposes, it's always important or much better to give the direct path. So the origin, we have to make sure we are giving the client side origin, so where the request is coming from. You can have an array of strings. So first you can have this origin for your testing purposes, and then you can have one for production. So whenever you have your domain, you can just also put it here. the methods, I will remove the method for now, but you can make sure you are restricting the methods to the API. So I will remove it for now. I'll remove this one for now also. So now let's save it and run the code again. We still have an error. So the error still persists. We need to look into the backend code again, and then inside the index.ts file. So we can see we are trying to visit, the request is trying to come from the local host, and then we have the base part appended to it. So we need to remove this part and try and save the file and test it out again and see. Moment of truth. So now it works. So these are some of the minor details that can always hinder your progress, so you need to keep an eye out for them. So now we can get the data. It says it's fetch data not found in cache, which means we are sending it from the main request, and now the data fetched from cache. Okay, so now our application is optimized for high efficiency. So let's display the message on the screen instead of displaying them in the console. So inside app.ts, give a span tag here. Then I will just render the message. So obviously we are just doing a conditional rendering. So let's say when the data is present, then we need to display the data.message. So the data does not exist, so it should be optional. The data should be optional in case when the data is not present, it doesn't break your code. And moreover, we need to define some types. Let's check what we have. So it's data dot data. We still have message also. We have message as well. So data, and then we have message. Should be correct, but we need to give some types to it. So let's say any here. I will just give it any, but usually you have to define the types that you are expecting for it. So I'll give it any, and then problem solved. Now it says data not found in cache. Now data fetched from cache. So now we are done. So that's the wrap up for our deep dive into setting up a scalable full stack application. You will find a complete source code on GitHub and a detailed article about this project linked in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe.